It's easy to forget that silence can be a strategy. But when it breaks, especially after years of being weaponized as dignity, it can be deafening. And that's exactly what just happened. Prince Harry is back in London, seated inside the United Kingdom's highest court. This was supposed to be the final act in his long battle against Britain's tabloid press. A fight, he says, for truth, for privacy, for a future unshackled from the damage done by headlines printed without consent. But in the shadows of this carefully staged courtroom drama, something unexpected shifted. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Chelsy Davy, yes, that Chelsy Davy, has entered the scene. Not as a witness, not as a commentator, as a plaintiff. For nearly a decade, she said nothing. No interviews, no memoirs, no cashing in on what could have been a tabloid goldmine. She walked away, or at least, that's what we thought. But today, she's preparing to walk into court, and not to defend Harry, to challenge him, for defamation. Now pause here for a second, because if you're thinking this is just another messy Royal X story, stop. This is something else, something more precise, and far more dangerous. Ask yourself this. What would push someone like Chelsy, who has dodged the royal spotlight for over a decade, to suddenly take legal action now, in the middle of Harry's final privacy trial? This wasn't random timing, and it wasn't personal revenge. It was something he said, or maybe something he didn't. And it may change not only the outcome of his trial, but the narrative he spent years carefully constructing in front of the world. Because here's the part no one's talking about. In laying bare his story, Harry may have rewritten hers. And in doing so, without naming her, without needing to, he may have crossed a legal line that's hard to uncross. Defamation isn't always about lies. Sometimes, it's about implication, about what's left out, about what's implied when the world already knows who you're talking about. Chelsy's move, quiet, deliberate, and coordinated with top legal counsel, suggests one thing. She's not just angry. She's ready. And Harry? Sources close to him say he didn't see this coming. That in his bid to hold the press accountable, he never imagined being held accountable himself by someone he once claimed to love. So where does that leave us? With two stories unfolding in the same courtroom, but with entirely different truths at stake. One about public lies, the other about private truths. But what Chelsy Davy just did might unravel both. And that's where things begin to spiral. Because as this courtroom filled with journalists and lawyers begins to quiet again, one question is starting to echo through the halls. What happens when your truth becomes someone else's defamation? And the answer? That's coming next. What happens when your truth becomes someone else's defamation? Well, first, you walk into a courtroom thinking you're the one finally taking control of the story. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, you lose the narrative. Let's go back to the moment it started to turn. Prince Harry returned to London with one objective: to end it. To bring finality to years of legal warfare against the British tabloid press. This wasn't a casual visit. It was a statement. An arrival marked not by fanfare, but by resolve. A controlled entrance. A tightly managed public image. A courtroom presence that said, "I am not backing down." He sat upright. Clipped suit, composed face. The press outside the royal courts of justice buzzed, but inside, it was silent. Heavy. The kind of silence that knows it's being watched. And at first, the script seemed to hold. This was meant to be the final battle. The third of 3 major lawsuits against the press. His team framed it as a reckoning. Not just for Harry, but for everyone who'd ever had their phone hacked, their private moments sold, their past dragged into the public square for profit. It was meant to be surgical, precise, controlled. But something about this one felt different. Not because of the press, because of what Harry started saying. See, here's the thing about privacy. It's not just about intrusion. It's also about protection. And once you start describing your pain, your triggers, your memories, especially when those stories involve other people, you're not just opening a door. You're unlocking it for everyone else in the story, too. Harry gave testimony that was, by all accounts, emotional, honest, at times, even vulnerable. He talked about relationships, betrayal, being used. He didn't name Chelsy, no? But when you date a prince for 6 years, through university, through Africa, through royal pressure and tabloid chaos, there are certain things people remember. Certain connections the public doesn't need spelled out. He didn't have to say her name. And yet, the shadow of her hovered over every word. When he spoke of trust shattered, of women driven away by media attention, of manipulation, the courtroom may have heard it as narrative. But outside, in the wider world, people heard something else entirely. They heard her name. And this is where the contradiction starts to throb. The man fighting to guard his own privacy may have pierced someone else's. Did he mean to? That's murky. But in law, intent isn't always the measure. Impact is. And behind the courtroom doors, whispers had already begun. Not from the journalists. From lawyers. From insiders. From people who understood what it meant when one story, told too loudly, begins to blur the lines of another person's silence. But the real twist? It wasn't just the public who noticed. Chelsy did too. And what she did next changed the entire rhythm of this case. Because suddenly, Harry wasn't just a plaintiff. He was a potential defendant. And as the courtroom lights glared just a little hotter, there was a shift. A small one, but unmistakable. It was in his posture. A moment of recognition. That something was about to hit. There's a sound people forget to listen for in courtrooms. It's not the judge's gavel. It's not the clatter of reporters tapping away. It's the sound of a name that hasn't been spoken, being felt. Chelsy Davy didn't need to be called to the stand to make herself known. She did something far more precise. She filed. After years of carefully staying out of the royal echo chamber, she chose now, of all moments, to step forward. And not with a statement. Not with a memoir. With legal papers. So let's ask the question that no one seems ready to answer. Why now? Why, after more than a decade of calculated silence, did Chelsy Davy decide this was the line that couldn't be crossed? Let's rewind just for a breath. Not to rehash the relationship, but to understand the terms of its burial. Chelsy was never the royal girlfriend archetype. She resisted the pageantry, disliked the attention, recoiled from the palace etiquette. In interviews, when she rarely spoke, she said it plainly. Too much chaos. Not a life I want. So she stepped away, graduated from law, launched a business, built her life in parallel, not in protest. Always polite, always peripheral. She could have written a book. She didn't. She could have taken interviews, sold exclusives. She passed. And in doing so, she carved out a kind of dignity for herself, a rare thing in royal orbit. But dignity has limits, especially when someone else's story grazes yours. From what we understand, Chelsy's legal complaint doesn't center on one phrase. It's about the cumulative weight of suggestion, the impression left in the wake of Harry's sworn testimony. She claims that by referencing certain relationships in connection with media manipulation, emotional instability, and personal sabotage, without naming names, he created a public association that deeply mischaracterized her. And here's the twist. She might have a case. In defamation law, it's not always about direct accusations. It's about identification. If the average person could reasonably link the description to a specific individual, especially a public one, that's enough to trigger liability. And let's be honest, people knew. Social media threads lit up. Commentators speculated. Old photos resurfaced. Articles from years ago were recycled to fit new interpretations. The silence Chelsy had so carefully guarded, it was shattered, not by paparazzi, not by tabloids, but by the man who said he was fighting against both. It's a devastating irony, and it's why her move is more than legal, it's symbolic. This wasn't a press leak. This wasn't PR retaliation. This was an official, deliberate move, backed by legal firepower, crafted for maximum impact, timed, not randomly, but right when the spotlight was burning hottest on Harry's version of events. So what now? Is this the beginning of a broader unraveling? Is the public fight for privacy about to be met with a private fight for reputation? We don't know the full contents of her filing yet, but insiders suggest it's sharp, focused, and aimed with precision. And the part that really stings? Some say she warned him. A quiet word. A message passed. Leave me out of this. But he didn't. And now? Now she's in it. And what happens next may flip the entire trial on its head. Two legal battles weren't supposed to intersect. But that's the problem with truth in a courtroom. It doesn't stay in one lane. Harry's privacy trial was structured, contained, aimed squarely at the tabloid machine. But what Chelsy Davy did, quietly, decisively, punctured that containment. And now, the lines are starting to blur. We're in murky territory here, because now we're dealing with something most legal teams dread: narrative conflict inside the same courtroom. Let me explain what that means. Harry is asserting that he was victimized by a press that spun, twisted, and invaded. And he's asking the court to recognize the emotional, personal, and psychological damage done by those narratives. That's one story. But now, simultaneously, Chelsy is implying that Harry himself, perhaps unintentionally, has become the narrator of a damaging story. One that used her life, her history, her name, even if unspoken, as fuel. That's a different story. And the two don't align. Here's the real kicker. Both sides claim harm. Both claim to have been misrepresented. And both may be right. But the court doesn't deal in symmetry. It deals in precedence, impact, credibility. So what happens when the plaintiff of one case becomes the implied aggressor in another? It gets complicated. Because now, every word Harry says under oath can be scrutinized not just by the defense lawyers from the tabloids, but by Chelsy's legal team as well. Every phrasing, every anecdote, every vague reference to relationships strained by media intrusion becomes potential evidence. Not just for him, but against him. That's a dangerous position to be in. Strategically, legally, emotionally. And there's irony here. A deep, cold irony. This was meant to be the story of Harry reclaiming control. A man once hounded by flashbulbs and headlines finally speaking his truth on his terms. But truth, when told too broadly, can start to erode the very boundaries it's meant to defend. Especially when someone else's silence is part of what's being told. And here's where it all starts to collide. Behind the scenes, legal advisors are reportedly scrambling to adjust statements, to reframe prior claims, to contain the risk. There's talk, unconfirmed but consistent, of private negotiations being initiated. Not with the press, with Chelsy, damage control. But it might be too late for back channels. Because when two legal strategies intersect like this, when one side demands accountability and the other demands correction, you're no longer dealing with a single fight. You're dealing with Crossfire. And the question now isn't whether someone will be wounded. It's who will bleed first. It's strange how fast a narrative can turn. One moment, Prince Harry is in a courtroom, positioning himself as the wounded party. The next, he's navigating the quiet but dangerous possibility that his own words may have become collateral damage. That's the thing about truth. It isn't sterile. It's emotional, uncontrolled, and sometimes it leaks into places you didn't mean for it to go. This trial was never just about the tabloids. It was about power, who controls the story, and who gets to walk away with their version of it intact. But now, that power is shifting. Chelsy Davy didn't storm the courthouse. She didn't hold a press conference. She did something far more devastating. She challenged the very foundation of Harry's narrative. Not with rage, but with restraint. And in doing so, she exposed something quietly explosive. That even in seeking justice for yourself, you can cause harm. That trauma doesn't excuse implication. And that privacy, when turned outward, becomes its own kind of weapon. And Harry, well, for a man who has long said he was forced to live life on other people's terms, he may now find himself redefining what accountability actually looks like. When it's not aimed at the press, but at someone he once claimed to protect. The implications of this aren't just personal. They're public. Because if this defamation case proceeds, if Chelsy's claims are validated, it will redraw the boundaries of what speaking your truth legally means. It could change the way memoirs are written, how documentaries are structured, how courts interpret unspoken names, past relationships, and public memory. And that lingers. Because there's no clean ending here. No sharp gavel, no final quote. Just a silence, newly charged. The kind that makes you wonder, what else was left unsaid in that courtroom? What happens if Harry's own words, meant to protect him, start to quietly unravel the very case he built? And more importantly, who gets to tell their story when someone else has already told it louder? We don't have that answer. Not yet. But one thing is clear. This trial isn't ending. It's evolving. And what comes next won't be about the headlines Harry sued over. It'll be about the ones he never meant to write. If you've been following this closely, share your thoughts below. Does this shift your view of the trial? Don't forget to subscribe. We're not done yet. Because the fallout of truth is rarely quiet.